Thank you very much. Good morning. I'm Damon Wilson. I'm the Executive Vice President of the Atlantic Council. It's my pleasure to welcome you to what I expect to be an important conversation. We want to encourage you to join in and all those watching online to join the conversation throughout the day with your comments and questions using the hashtag ACEurasia. So today we have a purpose. We aim to champion the front lines of freedom and to erase the gray zone. So put another way, we're here to consider whether and how we recommit to a Europe whole, free, and at peace, a Europe in which there is no sphere of influence, no coerced nation, no gray zone. So I'd like to offer some context for today's conversation before we launch into the panel discussions. We celebrated in 1989 the Berlin Wall when the Berlin Wall came down, and again in 1991 as the Soviet Union dissolved. And the formerly captive nations of Central and Eastern Europe liberated themselves from communism and Soviet domination. Central Europe and the Baltic states acted decisively during this historic window of opportunity and anchored themselves not only in the West, but in its institutions of NATO and the European Union. The path for Europe's East has been a bit more difficult. In 2008, as we debated the aspirations of Georgians and Ukrainians at NATO's Bucharest summit, we witnessed that the historic window of opportunity, we witnessed it come slamming shut. In the face of Russian hostility, Georgia and Ukraine's uneven progress at the time, and the West's ambivalence, NATO failed to reach consensus. Allies did not extend a membership action plan to help Georgia and Ukraine prepare for membership. However, they agreed the two aspirants would be members of NATO one day. This indecision among allies in Bucharest led to decisive action by NATO's then self-declared adversary in Moscow, the war in Georgia. In the wake of the crisis, you can argue perhaps that the United States and NATO stepped back, and the European Union stepped forward with the Eastern Partnership. Underestimated at first, Putin soon concluded that he had to stop the EU's initiative as well. The EU's offers of political affiliation through association agreements, economic integration through deep and comprehensive trade agreements, and elimination of barriers through visa liberalization, these were the ingredients to accelerate the adoption of European norms and values in post-Soviet nations. They created facts on the ground in which individual choices by people in these countries shaped a country's strategic orientation. So therefore, he coerced Armenia to stop this process. He tried to stop Moldova. His efforts to coerce Ukraine to stop the process produced the Revolution of Dignity. And the Kremlin responded with the illegal annexation of Crimea in 2014 and the invasion of Donbass. So today, there's a little bit background to our conversation, but today in 2018, we see a Kremlin that seeks in some respects even more to roll back decades of gains in Central Europe and to prevent such advances in Europe's East. And we're going to talk about both of those today. Moscow's efforts to undermine democratic institutions, propagate disinformation, and wield corrupt influence, they all aim to restore its influence in Central Europe, splinter NATO and the EU, block their expansion east, and undermine the sovereignty of the nations in Europe's East. So indeed, Russia aims to establish a permanent gray zone between itself and NATO and the European Union. But some in Moscow are learning that the people of the region have a say. Many of them are here with us today. Thank you for coming. And you won't have it. So the premise of my argument is that we owe it to those struggling for their own nationhood, their own freedom to choose their destiny, to recognize that this region is no gray zone. This is the front line of freedom. They merit our support. Permitting these nations' aspirations to be held hostage by Russian occupation and intimidation is a recipe for instability and conflict in Europe. We cannot allow these nations, known as captive nations for much of the 20th century, to become known as hostage nations of the 21st century. Rather, I believe we should recognize that they stand on the front line of freedom and allow those that choose to be anchored within the West and its institutions to ensure peace in Europe's East. And that's why we're here today, to rally for a just cause, to debate it, but also as an American to think about how we pursue our own interests, because welcome the aspirations of those in Europe's East is the best pathway to both stability and peace. So today I hope that we can draw on some inspiration from the example of the captive nations. It was in 1959, thanks in part to Lev Dobryansky, who's the father of an Atlantic Council Executive Board Director, Paula Dobryansky, Congress passed and President Eisenhower declared Captive Nations Week. This tradition continues today. And during the Cold War, the Captive Nations Resolution, it provided a rallying cry, a narrative, and it provided a forum aimed at the liberation of states dominated by communism and at stigmatizing Moscow's egregious behavior. The concept was simple. It provided a common front, it rallied Americans behind a moral cause, and it gave agency to the nations concerned. After all, they were nations, but captive. So informed by this legacy, I believe we must understand the challenge of nations in Europe's East as a common challenge, one of ensuring their nationhood. That is their ability to be sovereign, whole, free nations with their own identity, free to choose their own destiny. They are no longer captive nations, but they do risk becoming hostages. So these are the nations on the front lines of freedom today. We cannot and should not defend every action they take or every leader they choose. That's not the point. Let's face it. Reality in many of the nations in Europe's East, it's messy. You know this well. But we can defend their right to freedom, their right to determine their own destiny. So these ideas may seem a little counterintuitive at a time of transatlantic debates and divisions and heightened tension with Russia. Yet a big transatlantic project could actually help anchor the West. It would provide Russia with a more predictable set of neighbors. It would remove uncertainty, gray zones that tempt a revanchist Russia. And precisely because of geopolitical tension, the elimination of gray zones of insecurity can help ensure a durable peace in Europe's East. The strategy is not meant to create new dividing lines in Europe. The aim is to anchor a vulnerable, insecure zone in the certainty of a stable and prosperous and free Europe. And over the long term, this vision includes a democratic Russia. But the pathway to reform in Moscow might just begin with choices that are made in Kiev, Chisinau, Yerevan, and Tbilisi. So today we're here to discuss Georgia, the Republic of Moldova, Ukraine, along with the wider region of Eastern and Central Europe and the Caucasus. This conference is part of the Atlantic Council's broader strategy to erase the concept of a gray zone. Our Eurasia Center, under the leadership of Ambassador John Herbst, the team members, Emily, Shelby, who are with us today, they've been honored to help champion this issue, including on Capitol Hill. We have some colleagues joining us from the Hill, where an active resolution on these issues is under debate, while also helping to catalyze a more concerted effort among Georgia, Ukraine, and Moldova in particular to promote cooperation among themselves, to grow their allies abroad, and to present their case as a common cause. Conversations like this are vital to ensuring that these former captive nations of the Soviet Union do not become the new hostage nations of the Kremlin regime.